All right, so I have some questions for you this morning. We need some audience participation here. Have you ever wanted something you didn't have? Anybody? Okay, we've got some we've got some honest people, stripped of any judgment here. Have you ever looked at something someone else could do and wanted to be able to do it like they could, or looked at something someone else had and wanted to do whatever it took to get that thing or that life? Okay. Janelle's not putting his hand up, but he's giving me a sober nod. Okay, I'll take that. So they say, preach what you know. And they also say, make it relevant to the people you're preaching to. And when I thought about the thing that I have most wanted in my life, I realized I can't do both of these at the same time. Because try as I might to think of a better example, the thing I have wanted the most that I didn't have for the longest time in my life was a wheelchair. Obviously. Now, this wasn't just a passing time-to-time fancy in my life. From the time I was about 5 years old, they caught and held my attention with this laser-sharp focus. Whenever I saw someone with a custom wheelchair, I would check out its lines, I would check out how smoothly it rolled, I was looking for extra features, like some of them can carry like arm crutches on the back, they have fancy foot plates, there were all these different colors you could get them in, like if I could catch a glimpse of it, some of them have some really funky seat styles. I know you've all been looking too, so you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? See, once upon a time I actually thought that everybody did this when they saw a wheelchair. That everyone looked at them longingly or critically. And brief show of hands, how many else in the room have wanted a wheelchair? Not just for like some tricks for a couple of hours, but like please, can I spend my life in a wheelchair? Carrie wants roller skates. That's not quite what I'm talking about here. No. Tandy does not want roller skates. Fair, okay. So it turns out that this longing of my body wasn't just a normal, everyday thing. This was a longing that told me something about an unmet need in my life. And sadly, I assumed, like lots of other disabled people, that I had to wait until some professional looked at me and assessed me and said, it is time, Heather, for you to get a new mobility device before I actually got one. And so instead, I got really, really, really sick and ended up in the hospital for 6 weeks before I got one. But that doesn't mean that these longings weren't important to listen to. Just because nobody else saw them doesn't mean I wasn't right. So, all right, that one didn't work. You didn't jive with that one. Let me try something else. I know a bunch of you in this room are mechanically minded. You think about cars a lot. So show of hands, who else has carefully categorized all the different types of accessible vehicles and conversion modifiers, and so that you recognize them on the streets as the vehicles go by and immediately critique their pros and cons inside and out by the subtle differences in like body shape and vehicle type? Anybody? Not to live in as a van. Punya does. Punya notices. I know he does. Yeah. And he knows exactly which one's my van. If I'm at the grocery store and he shows up, he knows I'm there. It's very impressive. But anybody else like really longed to have a wheelchair van for themselves? Basically, no, except for Punya, who's going to just grow up to be my van driver. It's going to be amazing. It turns out that this, again, was one of those longings that told me something about something that was missing in my life, right? And even if these aren't your desires and longings, even if they don't match up with your particular body's wants and needs, I'm hoping you're starting to get where I'm going here. Because I need us to start this message, you can go to the next slide here, by acknowledging that desire and longing are complicated ideas for us to navigate as human beings sometimes. See, sometimes when we want things we don't have yet, it can tell us something really important about something we need. And it can spur us on. It can motivate us to make positive choices, to help us understand what matters to us better, to help us discern what path to take in terms of our education or our careers or our family lives. In other words, sometimes desire can be this wonderful force of good. And sometimes, when we want things we don't have yet, we end up toiling under the weight of discontentment. We sour to what is good in our lives. We brood and we sulk and we pull back from anything else that's good because we can't have the one thing we're convinced we need. And so we miss out on the enormous possibilities and opportunities available to us. And not uncommonly, it can even turn to destruction for us and those around us. We'll come back to this in a few minutes, but before we go on, I have another question for you. How many advertisements do you think you see every day? I know we don't live here, I know, but how many advertisements, on average, do you think you see every day? Too many? 500. Okay. What else? 2,000. 755. Very precise answer. Thank you. Thank you. 500? Okay. So back in 1970, the average person in North America encountered between 500 and 1,600 advertisements every day. Yeah, Janelle's still in 1970. He just hasn't moved on. That's okay. We love him. They were on billboards as they walked down the street, in the newspapers they read, on the train or bus to and from work every day. They were on the television and radio programs they tuned into from their homes and their vehicles. 500 to 1,600 advertisements feels like a high number, right? It's a lot of advertisements to be bombarded with every day. It's a lot of times to be encouraged to switch to the latest, greatest in soft-touch telephones, available only for those whose phone numbers start with 000, by the way, to be asked if you are man enough to wear this super hip and stylish menswear jumpsuit, only $45, or to be encouraged to open your very own 8-track factory. Flipping through all these ads, I found out that it was great news that McDonald's hamburgers are still just 15 cents, that there was ample room in the back seat of all the best vehicles. I don't know what they were going to do with that. And that seemingly nothing, I kid you not, nothing was illegal to use to sell either cigarettes or cocaine. It was an interesting education. A lot of the product ads I found were like these ones, for things now so obsolete that they seem laughable to us today. But at the time, these were the cutting edge of technology, fashion, and communication. And people couldn't get through the day without seeing between 500 and 1,600 of these ads. Fast forward a generation to the 1990s. Who can guess what year the first internet ad showed up? 1989, no. 1997, no. 94 is right. Give it to Dan. He knows his stuff. From what I could find, the best answer is that the first internet advertising company, Hotwire, started offering ads in 1994. I found what is purported to be the first internet ad. It was so garishly doing this that I thought I was going to give people migraines or a stroke to put it up, so we skipped that. The 90s came back, they were calling. Just 2 years later, in 1996, internet advertising was already a $157 million a year business. And a year after that, the numbers had more than doubled, and internet advertising was well established. So with the advent of internet advertising, the daily opportunities for us to be bombarded with ads skyrocketed. By 2007, if we weren't using ad block, we were seeing an average of over 5,000 ads a day, what people, perhaps rightly, considered an out-of-control number. Thank you, Sid. In 30 years, we had increased our exposure to advertisements by as much as 10 times, and yet the content of those advertisements was remarkably similar. Instead of a soft-touch home phone, the latest craze was a flip phone, complete with diamonds embedded in the case. The new millennium demanded a new, bold look that you still might have to be man enough to wear, I'm not sure. And now you didn't need a factory of 8 tracks to be able to carry your 10,000 songs with you wherever you went. A lot more portable. You also didn't need like a whole, trailer system behind your vehicle for them. More than 5,000 ads a day via internet, radio, television, and billboards in 2007, but it turns out even that was just the beginning. Statistics from 2021, 2 years ago, now suggested we were seeing 6,000 to 10,000 ads a day on average. And looking at these images, all I can say is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I especially laughed when I realized that a flip phone is once again cutting-edge technology. And all these advertisements and images are there, one way or another, for one simple reason: to tell you that your life will be better if only you acquire a thing you do not currently have. But here's the thing. We can all tell when we're seeing an ad. We see so many of them so constantly and with such well-developed self-protective mechanisms in place that it's extremely difficult for psychologists to pinpoint the psychological impact of all these ads on our short and long-term well-being. I found one study. I looked for a while. I found one long-term study done by a university in England between 1980 and 2011. And in this study, they tracked the connection between increased spending on advertisements in certain companies and happiness in those countries a year or two later. So they gave it longitudinal research. And what they concluded was that happiness was negatively impacted by advertisements because advertisements served to raise people's aspirations, making them feel that their own lives, achievements, belongings, and experiences were inadequate, and therefore that they required something more to make them feel better. This makes sense to us intuitively, right? Obviously, the advertising industry wouldn't exist, and it wouldn't be a $781 billion industry if it didn't change our behavior in significantly meaningful ways that result in increased profits for the people investing in the advertisements in the first place. And it's not just the ad industry that's after us in terms of cultivating these desires. Think about the content you browse through on social media, even if you could get rid of the ads on social media, which I understand is getting increasingly difficult. How much of it is content that makes you think, oh, I wish I could be like, oh, I wish I could have, oh, I wish I could do, if only whatever it is that is in that post. But, like I was saying earlier, just because all this money is being spent trying to make us change our behavior, and just because we're scrolling through social media and thinking about alternative futures isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Desire in Scripture can be holy. Solomon desires to build a temple to house the Ark of the Covenant, and God says this is a good desire. We're told that God desires mercy and not sacrifice, that Jesus eagerly desired to eat his final meal with his disciple, that Paul desires to visit various friends in his numerous letters. Desire for a world that is different than the one we currently live in inspires us to develop creative solutions to the problems we face. Desires can indicate gifts we've been given by the Holy Spirit, help us decide what steps we want to take in terms of education or work, and even help us tune in to physical needs that we might be ignoring. Desire can help us make better decisions about how we want to prioritize our time and our talents and our energies. But this morning, I was asked to speak on envy as one of the 7 deadly sins. So we have to start by figuring out what exactly it is that goes wrong when holy desire turns to envy. I think envy is a perversion of desire. So just like lust is a perversion of love. So what's the difference between desire and envy? That's the question. The desire to have a thing we don't have yet, in its perverted form, is a seemingly ancient human force that leads not just to discontentment, but also to destruction. Think about it. The very first recorded sin in the Bible is what? Adam and Eve, okay? And then the first recorded sin after they leave the garden is what? Cain killing Abel, right? At its heart, though, that's a sin of envy. Cain and Abel both brought their offerings to God, but God only accepted Abel's offering. And so what does Cain do? Out of envy, for the approval God gave to Abel, Cain kills his brother. Or think about the sons of Israel. 12 sons in total, right? 10 of them are older than Joseph, all of them strapping men, capable of hard work and achieving great success in life. But Joseph, he's a little bit different. He's a little bit different. And Joseph's differences make their father particularly fond of him. And they get envious of what he has that they don't have. And they capture him and tie him up and throw him down an empty well until they have a chance to sell him into slavery. Or think about King Saul. When he started to see the accolades and praise that David was getting from the crowds, right? It says in 1 Samuel 18 that he got so upset by what David had that he didn't have, that he went on a rampage against David, hurling his spear at David in an attempt to pin him against the wall. That's a lot of destruction. As human beings, along with the desires that fuel us and motivate us to become more fully the people Jesus would be if Jesus were us, it can be really easy to get envious of things that other people have, things that seem to make other people's lives easier or better than ours. Things that we wish could be changed. I think that all these social advertisements and hours browsing social media don't make that easier. The constant comparison with one another and jockeying with one another for position that happens around us, even if we're not actively participating in it, just reinforces this urge toward envy. And I think that because we swim in this soup of intentional envy provocation, it can make it hard for us to realize just how dangerous it might be for us at any given moment. But the writers of Scripture seem pretty convinced that this perverted desire is going to get us into trouble. James 3:16 tells us that where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. And then in the next chapter, he tells us that when you covet something and cannot obtain it, you engage in disputes and conflicts. This envy thing breeds a discontent in us that makes us selfish. And left to our own devices, it makes us willing to do whatever it takes to harm or ignore the needs of others so that we can get for ourselves what we are convinced we need for life to be worth living. I think it's for this reason then that envy ends up on the lists of deadly sins. Even though on its own, wishing you could have a nice thing seems like a harmless enough pastime. Mark 7:20-23, Jesus says, "It is what comes out of a person that defiles them. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, debauchery, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they are what defile a person." And Paul then goes on to echo these words in Romans 1 and in Galatians 5 and 1 Timothy 6. Like this is a theme that gets repeated in these lists of how people act when they are going against God's life-giving ways. Envy is always present in those lists. And I think the point is clear. What starts seemingly innocently as longing in our hearts for things we cannot have, over time can develop like a cancer in our souls to become a source of discontent that steals our joy, leaves us bitter, and can ultimately turn us to destructive ways of living. That kind of sucks, doesn't it? And while some of the things on these lists of what it looks like to live out of step with Jesus are pretty obvious, adultery, murder, drunkenness, and even though envy is comparatively easy to hide, James tells us that perhaps the only thing worse than wandering around with this bitter envy in our hearts is pretending it's not there. To lie to ourselves about its presence. Because when we do that, we miss out on any possibility of healing. This is true for envy, it's true for anything on that list. When we lie to ourselves about what's going on inside of us, that's where we really go wrong, because we miss out on the chance for healing. Anybody else feeling kind of awkward right now? Yeah, me too. Ads don't actually draw my attention a lot. Trevor installed ad blockers on my devices back in, I think, 2003, and so I've lived in a less advertising-filled bubble than a lot of people. And a lot of times when I do see ads, they're for things I either am not interested in, couldn't do, or have, and even if I had enough money, and so they mostly just kind of go over my head. I'm just not interested. And I realized that I could either be on social media or finish my degree, so I have not been on social media much recently. But that made it easy for me to think, well, maybe this is not really a big deal for me. Maybe envy isn't really my thing. Maybe that's a sin for somebody else. But the problem with working on the sermons, as Nathan keeps saying, is we have to keep working on the sermon all week. And as I worked on the sermon, I realized that might be a lie. It's possible. See, I do want things I don't currently have. They're just not advertised very often. They're not the sort of things other people maybe drool over. I can easily forget that my amazing partner has pushed me so that I could do a marathon, and instead get envious when people talk about their partners making them dinner, or cooking with them. Or indeed, like being willing to answer the question, what would you like for dinner? This is apparently an impossible question. I get envious of people who have that in their life. I have permission to say this too. I can easily forget about all the incredible privileges that living in Barrie gives me, including getting to be with you guys every Sunday morning, when I'm taking the train back and forth to Toronto to go to school. Because I get really envious of the passengers that get off like 20 minutes after we leave Union Station, right? 30 minutes, 40 minutes. Even the ones who get off at Aurora, I know they have trains in both directions all day, every day. I am a little bit envious about that. Or maybe a little bit envious about that, right? And just because some of my desires help me reveal tools I needed as a person to be able to live life better, that does not mean that every desire I have is like that. It is so easy to lie to myself, to try to make myself feel better about this. But if I do, James tells me that this pretense is even more dangerous than the envy itself. Which draws us to an important question. If envy is so easy to get to as human beings, and if we live in a world that is actively cultivating our envy, what are we supposed to do about it? Like, frankly, I don't really want to know I have a problem until I know that there's a solution coming down the pipe right behind it, right? Several of the writers of the New Testament tell us more or less to just stop being envious. I love it when they do that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, love does not envy, but rejoices with the truth. Well, there you go. You're all sorted now, right? No? Okay, let's try this one. 1 Peter 2:1 says, rid yourselves therefore of all malice and all guile, insincerity, envy, and all slander. Rid yourselves. Go, rid yourselves, be gone. But if you've heard me preach even once before, you know that I'm not much for a grit your teeth and try harder approach to spiritual transformation. In my experience, it doesn't work, and it leaves us feeling like either we or the Bible or God or some combination of this weird, odd Trinity is a failure. And that does not help us. It doesn't help any of us to become the people Jesus would be if Jesus were us. So what's the alternative? Thankfully, if we keep reading in 1 Peter 2, there's a hint. Verse 2 and 3, it says, "Instead, like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good." The instead isn't in the text, but it's implied here. Instead of all your malice and guile and insincerity and envy and slander, instead of all of that, since you've tasted that the Lord is good, long for pure spiritual milk so that you can grow into salvation. Tasting that the Lord is good is what shifts our focus and orientation away from the perverted desires of envy and onto the desires that will lead us to all the fullness of life that Jesus wants for us to have. So I ask you, how have you tasted that the Lord is good? I had Becca put some sticky notes and some pens at the end of most of the aisles. Hopefully there are some upstairs as well. Yes, excellent, marvelous. She's the best. I want you to take a sticky note and I want you to write on it something that you have noticed that is a point where you have tasted and seen that the Lord is good in like the last week. Where have you noticed God's goodness in the last week? And, if you've got more than one idea, feel free to take more than one sticky note and write on it. Where have you noticed that the Lord is good? Where have you tasted that? Where have you seen that? How has God been showing up for you in the middle of whatever you are going through right now? How have you heard God's voice? How have you felt God's presence? How have you been made aware that you are not alone? Write something down. Write a few things down. You see, the life-giving alternative to envy is to taste and see that the Lord is good. Not just to intellectually assent to the goodness of the Lord in some esoteric, out there kind of otherworldly way, but to notice, to cultivate a deep awareness of the goodness of God in your life today, right now, here. They say that our brains are wired to remember the negative over the positive, that it takes 10 positive moments to outweigh one negative experience in our lives. Well, our brains are not only wired for envy, they are swimming in a toxic ocean of envy-producing inputs, all of which can lead to discontent and even destruction. If we want to counteract this, it's going to require that we practice the discipline of gratitude, that we taste and savor and remember all the ways that the Lord is good. The result of this will be contentment. Hebrews 13:5 says this, "Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he himself has said, 'I will never leave you or forsake you.'" I went back to the Greek interlinear on this verse and I noticed two things. In Greek, if you want to emphasize a concept, you repeat the word or idea. And in this verse, the never isn't in there once. It's strengthened so that it effectively says, "I will never, not ever leave you, and I will never, not ever forsake you." That's a lot of nevers and nots, right? We're missing just how strong a sentence this is in our English translations here. And then I also realized that the word order here is a bit of a translator's decision. And I think we could rewrite the order for a bit of clarity, and it would leave us with this. If you focus on Jesus' words, "I will never, not ever leave you, and I will never, not ever forsake you," you will be able to keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. It's a reinforcement of the words in 1 Peter with a promise attached. Instead of discontentment, when we focus on the goodness of God and the presence of Jesus, we will be content with what we have. To Timothy, Paul writes, "Of course there is great gain in godliness combined with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world so that we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with these." To the church in Philippi, he says, "I have learned to be content with whatever I have. I know what it is to have little, and I know what it is to have plenty. In any and all circumstances, I have learned the secret of being well fed and of going hungry, of having plenty and of being in need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." For Paul, as for the writer of Hebrews, the knowledge of the goodness of God in their life is what frees them from the constant pressure of envy and makes them content in every situation. This is not a contentment that requires large amounts of money. It's not a contentment that requires that everything is going the way that we want it to go. It's not a contentment that's found in our relationships or our possessions or our positions or our accomplishments or our predicaments. It is freed from all of those things by the practice of gratitude, by remembering the goodness of the Lord. So, what will you do this week to remember? What will you do this month to recount the goodness of the Lord? How will you mark for yourself the moments when the Lord is good in your life and pick up on the presence of Jesus with you in the midst of the onslaught of messages trying to shape your desires? How can you fill the visual space of your life with tangible reminders of God's goodness? The reason I brought the sticky notes with me is that I found it helpful to put up visual reminders on my wall of the ways that God has and is showing up in my life. So what would it look like if this sticky note that you filled in this morning was the start of a gratitude wall above your desk or in your shop or on the end of your kitchen cabinets? What if as a family you each got a different color sticky note and each of you could add something to this gratitude wall on a regular basis? What if you celebrated regularly with each other what was on that wall? What would that look like? What would that change? How would that shape your character? How would it shape your desires? See, we can't escape a brain that is easily given to wanting what it doesn't yet have. And we can't escape a society that inundates us with advertising, $781 billion worth of it globally a year. Even if we turn on all the ad blocks, go on a social media fast, although that would definitely lower the intensity of it all. But we can find contentment. We can. It is possible. Whether life is good or bad, whether we are poor or rich, whether we feel like everything is the way we want it to be or nothing is the way we want it to be, we can find contentment by tasting and seeing that the Lord is good, by remembering that Jesus told us that he would never, not ever leave us, and never, not ever forsake us, and by placing our capacity to continue in the strengthening presence of the Holy Spirit. If the worship team wants to come up, I'll just pray. God, thank you. Thank you that you will never, not ever leave us. I know some of the stories of some of the lives in this room and some of the lives of the people who tune in with us. And God, some of these stories are hard stories. Some of us are carrying difficult things. Some of us are walking through difficult things. And the desire and the longing and the envy even for them to be different than they are right now is huge. God, would you help us to taste and see that you are good? Would you bring our attention back to your presence? Would you help us to pay attention? Would you help us to notice and pick up on all of the moments when you are showing up in our world with us? Would you help us to remember that we are not alone? And out of that, God, would you shape our desires so that they can be holy desires? so they can be desires shaped by and for your good purposes in our lives. And would we be content in whatever we have today? Amen.